everyone, this is Mindy Eggen. In today's video, I am going to be briefly talking about dye inks versus pigment inks. I will explain the differences and also similarities between the two, different techniques that you can use with them, and I will be showing how I used both pigment and dye inks on this snowflake card. First, let's take a look at some of the inks out on the market today. Now, this is just a collection of some of the inks I have in my stash, although there are many more out there. These inks on screen right now vary from pigment to dye to water reactive inks. I'm going to break these down into sections for you of the three different types of inks that I have. I'll show you a little demonstration using each one of them, and then you can decide what works best for you and your paper crafting needs. Let's take a look at the pigment inks. Here are a few of them that I have. These are from Hero Arts, Altenew, and Gina K Designs. Pigment inks are opaque and are great for both ink blending and stamping. They work really well on dark or craft colored cardstock, and one of the most significant things about pigment inks is that they stay wet longer than dye inks, which makes them really great for heat embossing. I'm going to show you how these pigment inks ink blend on different kinds of cardstock. I have some pitch black, craft, and white layering cardstock from Gina K Designs. When choosing a cardstock, you want to use something that is super smooth, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. To do my ink blending with the pigment inks, I am just going to be using a sponge dauber for right now. Now you can see that as soon as I picked up some of that ink with my sponge dauber, it picked up a lot of ink, and that is because it is the pigment. The pigment is very thick, and as I blended that on, the color is very bright right off the bat. Now I'm going to do this onto some pitch black cardstock. Now this didn't show up as well, but lighter color pigment inks do show up fairly good on dark colored cardstock or black colored cardstock. Then I can move on to the craft colored cardstock, and this shows up really well on craft. Also notice I did not go back to my ink pad to pick up more ink. I still have a lot of ink on my sponge. So if you are looking to do ink blending or stamping on craft or dark cardstock, pigment ink is a great way to go. Here's a look at some of the reactive inks that I have. Hero Arts has ink pads specifically for reactive purposes, and we also have the Distress line in regular distress ink and also the oxides. So the distress ink gives very vibrant colors. It has a felt pad, and you're going to notice the difference when I take the lid off and show you the oxide. Now, oxides are pigment and dye-based inks. And then here is a look at the Hero Arts, which is also a felt pad, and I will show you these in action as well. I do a lot of ink blending with these different types of inks, so I have specific tools designated for those specifically so that I don't cross-contaminate because of their different properties. Now here is the Hero Arts Reactive inks that I'm using with a blending brush. Blending on that color, you can see it blends on very smooth, and with a blending brush, I can slowly transition into the white of the cardstock. To clean off my brush, I just rub onto a towel or scratch piece of cardstock to clean off any of the excess ink. Then I'm going to spritz with a little water and dab up that excess water. These are great for underwater scenes or snowy backgrounds. Then we have the regular distress ink and the distress oxide ink, both with unique properties. First with the oxide, this is a unique combination of dye and pigment ink. It also leaves kind of more of a chalky look, but they are very forgiving, which is why they are usually kind of the preferred method of ink blending. So once again, I am just using a sponge tool to blend this on. You can see it blends on super smooth, really nice and easy. Then I'm going to flip this piece over and I will ink blend on some of the regular distress ink. Regular distress inks are more vibrant than the oxides. They take a little bit more work to blend, but they still make beautiful blends and are great for ink blending. I do highly recommend a really nice smooth cardstock if you're using the regular distress inks. A good tip when ink blending with the distress line is the more ink that you apply to the paper, the easier it is going to be to blend different colors together. So once again, I can spritz these with water, and because they are both reactive inks, they are going to leave water splotches on the background, which once again are great for underwater scenes or snowy scenes. For dye inks, these come in a variety from many different companies, some of which have felt or foam ink pads. Both are great for ink blending and stamping. They do dry quickly and can be used in many other techniques such as watercoloring, gel press printing, and ink smushing, just to name a few. Many companies have their own line of ink pads, a lot of times to match their cardstock. And a deciding factor for me when picking inks comes down to the color selection. When ink blending with dye inks, I do highly suggest a super smooth cardstock, such as Gina K Designs Layering White cardstock. Concord and Ninth has also a super smooth white cardstock, or Ranger Heavy Stock cardstock. I also have the Gina K Designs blending brushes that I use specifically for my dye inks, and then it's not contaminated with any reactive or pigment inks. Whenever I'm switching colors or switching companies, I just rub off my brush onto that towel or scratch paper. Now I'm going to show you how I ink blend with a 3-color combo from Gina K Designs, and also how I use the dye and pigment inks both on this snowflake card. I am starting with a piece of layering white cardstock from Gina K Designs that is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I will typically start with a larger piece of cardstock than what I intend my actual size to be, just so that it leaves me a little bit of wiggle room. I'm starting on one end of the card by ink blending on my lightest color out of this 3-color combination, and this is the Sea Glass ink. I am using my Gina K Designs blending brushes. A lot of times I will work on some sort of slick surface. It's easier for my brush to glide onto the cardstock, but you could also use a scratch piece of paper as well. Then I come in with my second color, which is the Tranquil Teal, so getting a little bit darker, blending up towards the other end of the card and also overlapping with that Sea Glass ink. I also wanted to just quickly show you how I have my blending brushes. I use this brush caddy from Gina K Designs, so it has a spot for each one of my brushes. Comes in really handy to have on my desk, and I don't have brushes laying around. Next, I'm going to come in with my final color, which is the In the Navy. So this is the darkest color out of all of it, blending into that Tranquil Teal. A lot of times I will go back and forth between the different colors just to help smooth out the transition. And if it looks a little splotchy, that is okay. That just means the ink is wet on your cardstock. A lot of times if you just give it some time to dry, it'll smooth out into some beautiful transitions between the colors. A lot of times when I'm ink blending, I start off fairly light-handed. It is a lot easier to get your transitions smoother this way. You can always add more ink to darken it up, but you can't take color away. Once this is all blended, I'm going to give this some time to dry because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing on top of it. Now, if this didn't have a lot of time to dry, you can always speed that process up by using your heat tool. And there's really 2 different ways that I could have created this card. I could have heat embossed first and then ink blended on top, but I prefer to ink blend first and then do my heat embossing. One of the reasons is that I will be able to see my stamping on top of this blended background. Now, a good way to test if your background is dry is just sprinkle on some embossing powder. If it slides off of the cardstock, it is dry and ready to be heat embossed on. But if it's sticking to that background, then you still need to dry that some more. To do my stamping of my background, I am going to use this delicate snowflake background stamp from Gina K Designs. I'm placing this in my Misty tool, removing my foam insert from my Misty because it is a red rubber stamp that's already foam mounted. Now for my background, I folded up a piece of Post-it tape and put that on the back of my panel. Then I lined that up over my background, closed my Misty backwards, and this allows my background to stick to the bottom of my Misty and won't move when I stamp it. Since I'm heat embossing, I am going to prep this with an anti-static powder tool, and then I'm going to ink up my background with the Gina K Designs embossing and watermark ink. A lot of companies have their own embossing ink. You just want to make sure you have a very nice sticky ink for this. Then I can close the door of my Misty and stamp this down onto my cardstock. Now, this is where I really like stamping after I ink blend because once I lift the lid of this, you're going to be able to see all of the snowflakes on that background. This helps me tell if I need to stamp it again or if I got a great impression the first time. Now, this is where that folded up post-it tape on the back of my background comes in really handy. It's in a loop, so I just slid my finger in that loop, and that allows me to keep my fingers off the background and I can sprinkle on clear embossing powder. So I'm just kind of twirling this background in my hand, and I can just get all of that embossing powder on there and tap off any excess. Off on the side, I have my heat tool warming up so that it's nice and hot when I bring it over to my cardstock. Being that it's warmed up, this is going to help minimize the warping of my background. Once this is heat embossed and has cooled off, I'm going to bring it back into my Misty tool. This time I put my foam insert back into my Misty, and I'm using a Misty corner to kind of push my cardstock up a little bit. This is the Sparkling Snowflakes stamp set, and it is very well loved, as you can see. And the reason I used the Misty corner is I wanted some of these snowflakes to kind of hang off of the edge of the cardstock. So I'm lining these up. I just have 3 of them picked out. They are going to overlap the snowflakes that I have stamped on the background already. Then I can pick these up with the door of my Misty, and I'll be able to stamp all 3 of these at one time. So I'm just going to readjust my cardstock back into that Misty corner, and once again I'm going to prep this with an anti-static powder tool. And this is where a white pigment ink comes in really handy. I use this technique for snowflakes and also heat embossing sentiments. This is the Gina K Designs white pigment ink, and when you are inking up your image, because it is such a thick ink, you want to do this gently. You don't want to squish this down really hard into your images because otherwise you're going to get ink seeping into all the cracks and crevices of your stamp and you won't get a very clean image. So I'm just gently pressing down to ink up those images. Then I can close the door of my Misty and just gently stamp these down. One of the reasons I really love stamping and heat embossing with white pigment ink is it provides such a great coverage and fills in all the little gaps. So after I remove this from my Misty, I am going to sprinkle on white embossing powder, once again tapping off any of that excess. Now I do really want to make sure that my heat gun is really nice and warmed up because I don't want to remelt the snowflakes underneath. Also, because of the pigment ink's opaque properties, these are stamped right on top of those snowflakes, so they're kind of covering up some of them, but still provides that snowfall background. Off screen, I trimmed out my panel with the Master Layouts 2 die from Gina K Designs. I added a white panel slightly bigger to add a white border, and then added to a card base die cut from In the Navy cardstock. So this is a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. To finish this off, I am adding a sentiment from Pink Fresh Studio. This is their Perfect Sentiments Holiday Foil Plate that is foiled in silver. Then I just added some foam squares behind the sentiment for a little dimension. I hope this brief introduction to dye and pigment inks has given you some ideas and inspiration and also helps you to decide which one is best for you and your paper crafting needs. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great day.